Yeah, and I think the key thing is, like, I call it kind of cutely tools and fuels, but it's really, you can think of it as like machines and fuels. So machines are basically these advanced tools that have a power source other than us. And I think it's important to realize that our whole modern way of life depends on these machines having a lot of energy. And that's why I find it helpful to look at the past and to see, before people had these high-powered machines, what was life like? And basically they had to live in nature. And as I mentioned, nature is a deficient place from a human flourishing perspective. It has very few usable resources. It's not the Garden of Eden, and it has a huge number of threats. And so what you need to do as a human is you can't just accept nature, you need to transform nature. But we're naturally very weak, right? We just have the tools of our bodies and then meager fuel supplies, and it's even hard to keep that going. So what we have to figure out is a way to get machines to do our work for us. And then those machines require a lot of energy. And so if you look at just all of modern life, just think about how much of our work do we have energy do for us? Do we have machines do for us? And there are good statistics like our machines do 100 times more physical work than we do. So our machines use 100 times more calories than we do. They use more calories so they can do more work, and they can also do different kinds of work. It's not like my physical body can display something on a computer screen. So we have this amazing phenomenon of we have these amazing tools called machines that can do every kind of work, but only if they have abundant fuel. And so if that fuel is not affordable, if it's not reliable, if it's not available, then our whole society is just scrap metal. And that's so when you're thinking about the modern world, it's important to A, appreciate just these amazing machines, and B, appreciate the fact that we have this incredible abundant fuel, which is because somebody has figured out how to produce that fuel in a way that is affordable and reliable for billions of people. And so every aspect of your life is these amazing machines powered by abundant fuel. Mm-hmm. And then the thing I would connect to that is it turns out it's very hard to produce that cheap, reliable energy for a lot of people. Like it's really, really hard. Looking at the history of energy, lots of people have claimed, oh, I can do it using the sun, I can do it using the wind, but it's like super, super hard. And so so everything that's distinctive about our modern way of life in terms of how productive and prosperous we are, how long we live, how much control we have over our lives, that is so dependent upon this incredible energy abundance that right now, over 80% of that comes from fossil fuels. So fossil fuels, I should say, that's coal, oil, and gas. And the reason they're called fossil fuels is they are fuels that are derived from ancient dead life, like different kinds of plant and plankton life. And so what happened is the general theory, at least is historically, that different kinds of life, really like ancient dead plants and small organisms, were compressed by natural forces into a very, very concentrated fuel source. And some of that is coal that you can dig up. Some of it is liquid in the form of oil. Some of it is gas. But it has this incredible thing where nature has concentrated a lot of energy for us, and it's stored a lot of energy for us. And that turns out to be amazingly beneficial, because if you look at, think about solar energy, nature doesn't concentrate it very much. The sun is very dilute energy. So like the sun shining on this building doesn't provide all that much energy, and it's not stored. It's not reliable. We can't access it unless we build something like a big battery to harness it. But what nature did is nature built us that battery already with fossil fuels, because fossil fuels stored the sunlight in the form of plants and other organisms, and then that got compressed into these usable energy sources. So we have this incredible naturally concentrated, naturally stored source of energy, and that's what's enabled us to get abundant fuel, and that's part of the reason it's so hard to replace. Now, my own very strong guess is that the thing that will replace it ultimately is another naturally concentrated, naturally stored source of energy. Because if we're dealing with naturally concentrated, naturally stored ancient dead plants, at some point you're going to run out of those because we're using them faster than they get generated by nature. But the amazing thing about nuclear power is that's even more of a concentrated and stored source of energy. Like the nucleus of an atom just compresses an unbelievable amount of energy. Just to give you an analogy, it's something like a golf ball of uranium, which is the material that you use for nuclear power, that contains as much energy as Yankee Stadium full of coal. And coal is incredibly compressed compared to solar. So there's just this fossil fuels, the fact that it's concentrated and stored by nature plus the ingenuity of the fossil fuel industry, that has made it this unrivaled source of abundant power. And it's useful to understand when we're thinking of alternatives, because if you're dealing with alternatives that aren't naturally stored, aren't naturally concentrated, they have a huge uphill battle, because then human beings have to use a lot of resources to store and concentrate the energy, and that's very difficult.
So before we get even more in depth into the different forms of energy, can you give us a couple examples of what life was like before people realized they could harness fossil fuels and all these other sources into energy? You had a stat in your book. It was something like what percentage of people were farmers as their main job?
Well, at different points, 90% plus.
Really? Oh, wow. 90% of people were farmers, because that's how you got your food, was just because you had to manually grow it yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, you just think of it, I keep going back to like tools and fuels. Your natural tools are just kind of your body, and then you need energy. And right, to keep going to the next day, you need a certain amount of fuel for your body. And then, hunter-gatherers, they basically have their bodies, and then the food they can put in their bodies, and kind of all they can do to live most of their life is just use their tools and their existing fuel to get enough fuel for the next day to repeat the process. That's what life is, just like the pure pursuit of fuel. That's the obsession. So we always need fuel. And then so of course everyone's going to be focused on food. Like, until you figure out a really efficient way to get food, everyone is going to be focused on food, because that's the absolute essential thing that everybody needs. And then, over time, we come up with certain things, like people come up with like windmills and water wheels to grind grain, and that helps you. And you have different kinds of agriculture, so you have animal power. But even there, what happens is, so people, they can get a little bit of abundance, but then a drought or something happens, and then they have a famine. They're just still not very productive. Their productive ability is still pretty limited when they're relying on their own body's fuel and then the fuel of animals, because they have to spend so much time just producing enough food for themselves and their animals, and it's hard to even get out of that just stasis. And that's what human life is like. So that's why everyone's a farmer, because they're so unproductive that all they can do is produce food. It's not like everyone had a dream of being a farmer, right? It's if you think about human flourishing, so much of it is you get to choose the activities of your life. And just think about with work, like you and I have obviously chosen non-farming things to do with our lives.
Surprised. No, I don't.
Right. So it's you think about that. It's so we spend so much of our lives doing productive work, and one of the amazing things to have in life is to have control over that, to decide, I want to do this kind of productive work. I want to do this kind of productive work. But the only way that we can have control over it is if we have all of these amazing machines that can do most of our physical work for us.
Yeah.
So for instance, I came up here from Laguna Beach today, so it's probably 2 hours. Like, how long would that journey have been 200 years ago, right? And both of these places were not inhabitable in the same way. So we just had all of these amazing machines powered by abundant fuel that makes it possible.
Actually, that's a good point. Would California even be, or I guess, what would living in California look like if we didn't have the machines that we have today? Because it's essentially a desert. Unless you're
different parts of it.
Yeah, different parts of it. But like, let's say, LA, that's super concentrated. Everyone wants to live here. Orange County, everyone wants to live here. Like, what would that even look like if it weren't for all the machines that we have? It's just an interesting question. It's like,
and there's a question of what did it look like? Concretely, but I mean, even, so one of the advantages of one reason why people like here, like a big part of life, I think, is you get to choose where you are.
Right.
Now, there's a lot of natural features of this place that are very nice, including there are some things about desert type conditions that are very nice. And then there are some things that aren't nice. And when you have modern machine power, what you can do is you can take a climate that has certain attributes you like, and you can enjoy those, and then you don't have to deal with others. So for instance, particularly when you're dealing in the valley and other places, you can have air conditioning. I mean, imagine life in the valley without air conditioning. It's just a complete nightmare. And then you can have food transported to you. Like, you can have all kinds of food, even if it's not the best place to grow all kinds of food. And then, I mean, just, one thing I think about a lot is industry, how great it is that human beings have all of these different industries and that we have all sorts of interesting work that we can choose. But so much of that is based on transportation. Basically, people in one place can get together and produce one kind of good really well, like coffee. I don't drink coffee, but a lot of people like coffee, right? And other people produce computers and they get together. And so much of that ability to do what you want and to specialize and to be around people you like working with is the ability to transport those goods all over the place. So appreciating energy, I think, properly means just appreciating human flourishing, and in particular, appreciating the amount of control we have over our lives versus the amount of helplessness that we had when we were living in what you might call the state of nature. And I never get tired of thinking about how good is life now compared to how it was before, in particular because you have billions of people where they're still living in many ways in nature. Now, people around the world benefit a lot from our prosperity in terms of different, like if you look at life expectancy, it's a lot higher even in poor parts of Africa than it used to be, in part because of what the industrialized world has figured out and invented. But there's still a huge amount of drudgery, a huge amount of suffering, a huge amount of languishing. And then we also see with places like Venezuela, it's possible to go back, right? You can go from more flourishing to more suffering. So we really should appreciate how good life is, and then what makes it good, and then what are the fundamental causes of that. Because if you take it as, oh yeah, life today is just normal, and oh yeah, I heard fossil fuels have some bad stuff, so let's get rid of those fossil fuels, that could be like outlawing vaccines.
Right. It's like kind of the cliche of not having the right perspective.
Yeah.
Of not looking at things relatively.
Right. And it's so exactly. So what you need is perspective. And so part of perspective is you need a goal for your perspective. So the goal, in my case, I'd say like the goal should be human flourishing. We should be evaluating the state of our environment, the state of our lives, the state of our economy from a human flourishing perspective. And then another part of perspective is that you're looking at the fullness of the whole context of things. You're looking at the positives of something and the drawbacks of it. You're not just looking at a picture of the world and all you can see is a smokestack. Right. You see like a factory and all you see is a smokestack. And that's what happens today. People, like they'll see a factory and they'll see a smokestack and they'll see something coming out of it and they'll say, I don't like that. I would like a world where that didn't exist. And they don't even usually know that's actually water vapor usually coming out of that smokestack.
Really? I used to do that when I would go surfing in El Porto, like near Manhattan Beach. They have those plants there. I don't even know what they are, what kind they are. But every time I drive by, because it's right on the beach, I'd be like, ugh, it just ruins the whole like natural beach scenery. And I don't even know what it is.
But that's a perfect thing. Like think about it. So I love the beach, and I go to the beach probably more than just about anybody. But I'm really aware. I try to be aware of what makes it possible for me to go to the beach all the time and to be relaxed. Like how can I go in the water every day and enjoy that? Well, if I just had to be a farmer all the time, working 16 hours a day, I certainly wouldn't be doing that. And if I were living in a primitive place, would I have a clean environment? No, I'd have an incredibly dirty environment. That smokestack, I would dream of that smokestack because I'd be living in human filth, in animal filth, with natural disease, natural bugs. Nature doesn't give us a clean environment. Like I say, it doesn't give us a safe climate we make dangerous. It doesn't give us a clean environment we make dirty. It gives us a very dirty and dangerous and unhealthy environment that we need to make clean.
Well, that's an interesting point because if I think back to the early days of when, they maybe not even the Industrial Revolution, but when people started using coal for more energy or whatnot, you kind of think of the stereotypical like London dirty, what were they called? The chimney sweepers or just everything was like dirty, right? Mm-hmm. But it's like, I guess back then it's like, because they were doing it, apparently they did think that the benefit was worth the dirtiness of whatever because they were doing it. I imagine if...
Oh yeah, the dirtiness... I mean, just overall, smoke used to be viewed as a positive thing. Like in advertisements, you would see a city. I think I don't know if I have a picture of this in the book, but I have a story about it in the book. I think it was Manchester. Like they would advertise smoke in the city as this is, no, because it's a sign of life. And it really is a sign of life because it's a sign of productivity. It's a sign of these machines helping you conquer, the naturally often very wretched state that we have to live in. So for them, it was natural to see the smokestacks in context. But as we got better and better, and as we could remove ourselves even more from the smokestacks, ironically, we became much more hostile to them, because then they think, well, I just want to go to the beach. I don't want any smokestacks anywhere, not in my backyard. And my backyard is the entire world. I don't want any smokestacks in anybody's backyard. Why do we have to have that? Versus, no, think of it as by the default state, you had really few resources and you had a lot of threats. Like that's how I think of the planet, as it's naturally deficient from a human flourishing perspective. We have very little in terms of the resources we need to live, and we have a huge amount of threats, including sanitation issues, filth, waste, disease. So that's the state. And what we figured out how to do is create these amazing machines and amazing fuel sources that could empower us to make our world much richer in resources, because we could take all the unusable raw materials and make them into resources, and then we could neutralize the threats. So for example, with disease, we can drain a swamp and help get rid of malaria that way, or we can come up with different kinds of chemicals that can get rid of different kinds of bugs. Or with climate, one example I think about is with a thunderstorm. A thunderstorm, like the same thunderstorm 200 years ago that would have struck terror into a community. Today, that could be like a romantic setting in a restaurant. Yeah, no, it's beautiful, but I think it is beautiful, but only if we recognize that that's our mastery of nature using, modern high-powered machines. But I like to think of it as we have an unnaturally abundant planet and an unnaturally safe planet. But that's the planet we've created. That's what I'll often call the human environment. We've taken an environment, a planet that wasn't very suited to human life, and we've humanized it. We've made it much more abundant in resources and much fewer in threats. And if we don't look at things like climate change in that context, we have these bizarre views. Like we think of it as, oh yeah, climate's more dangerous than ever. And anyone coming from 300 years ago would die for our level of climate safety. I mean, they did die because of their level of climate danger. So if you're thinking about maybe fossil fuels have a drawback in terms of some feature of the climate is less pleasant, well, you better realize that it's made the entire climate more pleasant than anyone could have imagined 200 years ago.
Really? I mean, we'll talk more about climate change, but what do you mean about that specifically, that the climate now is better than it was 200 years
Well,
ago?
but it's your experience.
Your experience.
But this is
Life.
like everything in life is sort of an interaction between, like there's the environment and then there's you. So take the thunderstorm example I gave, right? Like how did someone experience a thunderstorm 200 years ago versus today? It could be the exact same thunderstorm. It could even be a more dangerous thunderstorm today. But today they'd experience the thunderstorm in a positive way, and before they'd experience it in a negative way. So it's their experience of the climate that's totally different. So when they came to our civilization, how they would experience climate was something they'd be terrified of and praying to all the time, because it could punish them. They would think of it as punishing, and it could also reward them, in terms of a bumper crop. And now we have so much control over our environment, we don't have to worry about it nearly as much. We're not nearly as dependent upon it. So yeah, we've mastered it. So that our level of climate mastery is something that was unimaginable 200 years ago, and thus the positive, like our positive relationship with the climate is something that people would have never guessed.
So you're saying if someone from 200, 300 years ago came to today, their experience of the climate would just be a million times better.
Yeah, and all you have is really we talk about like the climate as this kind of isolated thing, but it's like this atmospheric system, and ultimately what matters most, I believe, is how individual human beings experience and how it either helps or hinders them in flourishing. So in terms of the livability of climate, life has never been better. And even if it was CO2 emissions were a lot more serious than I think they are, like you still have to keep in mind fossil fuels, abundant fuel gives you this incredible climate mastery ability that we don't want to lose, because whatever you don't like about the climate you forecast in 20 years, it's infinitely better than life was like for people 200 years ago.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching the episode. If you're interested in contributing to the conversation and supporting the show, there's 2 easy things you can do. 1, click subscribe, and 2, visit our Patreon page where you get exclusive access to the Exploring Minds community.